Okay, thank you very much, Malcolm, and it's been an absolute pleasure to be here. This is my first time in street level, assumedly, and I certainly will be back again. And we had the luxury of a talk with Frank, which just reinforced that common connections, and hopefully you'll see that as we go forward. It's not going to work. What's this one, you guys? There we go. So, briefly, and I'll not go on too much, but I do think it's important, the history of the organisation. And I think, yes, it was an activist response, but it was really born from the negative media representation that was portraying Belfast worldwide. An awful lot of photographers were shipped in from the Times, the Guardian, CNN, worldwide, and they were portraying these images of Belfast, and it was sensational at times. It was hard, and there's no doubt about that. But there was other things about Belfast and Northern Ireland as a whole that were important too. And what Belfast Exposed was wanted to literally show that other side. And now and again we get a cheeky phone call about actually what we were exposing, but at the same time it gave that opportunity, and it just grabbed people's attention whenever things were very low within our country. And it's, you know, people were portraying it was like we were Beirut. There was sing bombs happening, there was people being shot, but it was under the cover of another guise. And within that, the exhibition that took place in Colmay Mill was cross-community. It was amateur photographers and professional photographers. It was a band, mainly men, but not only. And it was a band of people who got together to show something different. And you know, this is sort of coming up to the times in the peace movement. People in Belfast, people in Northern Ireland really did start wanting to move on by then. So, but that grassroots level, it was really honed within communities, and that grassroots level is still within our organisation, and it's still the ethos and the values that we do, and it's important that we always remind ourselves of that. For the glitchy corporate term, our vision is to enrich people's lives through photography, and should that be through an exhibition or the well-being work we do, it's about your enrichment, and it's important that we do it. Again, our 40th anniversary is coming up, so we are going to be looking at our history, and it's also 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement, which is another landmark if we make it to there. And we did start off as a simple exhibition, and we grew into, it's hard because I used to be the officer of Belfast Exposed when I worked in the Arts Council and the City Council, and I just seen it as a gallery. And I knew it done other wee things behind the scenes, and it was really only whenever I worked and moved into the job that I actually seen the many things it does. And the gallery is like, if you think of an iceberg, the gallery's on the top, it's the showcase, it's what you can see, but there's such a wealth of things that happens underneath, and that connectivity with communities, and particularly well-being. During COVID, we decided to really embrace our knowledge, and Mervyn Smith, who is our engagement manager, has been doing mental health work for 25 years, so we've been harnessing that and developed into many packages. Some of them are corporate, which actually brings us in money, so it's helping making us be sustainable as well as doing that really socially good thing. I suppose the exhibitions, what we do, I suppose we're looking at contemporary curves. Again, I think you summed it up in a sense, Malcolm, that it really is about looking at what the social global issues is out there today, but it's also about pushing the boundaries. What is photography? I'm not interested in sitting still, so some of our shows will challenge beyond what people really want them to, and we've some very interesting shows coming up. And even this exhibition has opened new conversations, and it's about creating that dialogue and that opportunity to connect. And I suppose I was looking at, oh my goodness, you know, I could cherry pick any of the exhibitions I have in the future or in the past, but actually the more I looked at Frank's work, I felt that we were already connected. we hadn't talked about the shows we were having. Malcolm, I didn't know that this was coming up, and you probably didn't know what I had coming up. So, because the current shows that I have on at the minute really looks at those historic contexts, exploring migration and experiences of immigrants. It's about Irish-British cultural identity, and within that the subjects are contained are nationalism, effects of colonialism, we are still really impacted by that, patriotism as well, identity, and also in elements of racism, because that racism, we see it as a colour, but actually the Irish diaspora still kind of in some regions experience that. I know as an Irish citizen, Northern Irish citizen, whatever it is, we definitely have been challenged by it. I have dual nationality, not everybody realises that. I can have a British passport and an Irish passport at the same time, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but you know, think of that from a cultural identity. A wee while ago I was a European, and I'm not a European, but I'm still living in Europe. Brexit has had a massive impact on us. You know, that's our story of the future. But even as a Northern Irish person, because that's a non-political term, and it's one I've chose to name myself, because I am Irish and British, and I'm both, but I live in Northern Ireland. So until that changes, and probably that conversation about like Scotland and independence is coming up really soon, another very common thing that we have together. So the two artists I have on at the minute is the current exhibitions is Mairead McLean, and she's in our Gallery 1, and Barry Sutherland, re-imaging Trees, and she's in Gallery 2. The nice thing about this is because Mairead McLean, very much a Northern Irish artist, but an awful lot of her work has been done here in Scotland. And Barry Sutherland is Scottish. He's now living in Northern Ireland and is looking very much about that British cultural identity. And I just felt, well, there's a connection there, but also their subject matter has a very strong resonance with this exhibition. Barry here, I think she's an artist that has been pushed to the side. She's ended up teaching, she's academic, but she's been a consistent artist and an artist that works really hard and has kept going. She's lens-based and research, so that academic comes out, and she's exploring that imperialism and nationalism. And she's been interested in this, and she's took a very particular view on this, but it's about the contradictions of that Irish and British cultural identity. And really from the words and lives of Erskine Childers and Mary Spring Rice, and she selected those two people because she's connected them really through Erskine Childers' book. And Childers really wrote the first ever spy novel. Have any of you read it? No? I hadn't until this, actually. Very interesting. But he sort of was looking at it. The reason why he wrote the spy novel, because he was really concerned about the British vulnerabilities with the German and the war looming, and they hadn't really protected themselves. So he created this novel that paid attention to that vulnerabilities, and he was even noted by Winston Churchill for his contribution to the war. And with having that sort of Anglo-Irish identity, people challenged him and says, well, why did you do that? You know, what was you trying to do? The English this, the English that, whatever. And he said, I'm a patriot, and it was for my country, and I've done this for my country, and I don't mind putting my head above the parapet. But himself and Mary Spring Rice also became gun runners for the IRA in this private yacht, and they used to run the guns for them, which he actually was found out about, and he ended up being hung for treason. So he was very much patriot to his British culture, but he was also patriot to his Ireland. And so that continual question within, I found it really interesting, because it made me think, when I was reading up about what she was doing and her research, it sort of went like, what is my identity? Where do my loyalties lie? Certainly, if it's a football match, it's never going to be with England. That's it. You know, but at the same time, we tend to look at our neighbours, and if there's a World Football match on, it's obviously Northern Ireland, it's Ireland, it's Scotland, and the rest I don't really care about because it doesn't really matter that much to me. But there is that inherent loyalty that comes within, and England is mainly because they go on too much about it, and Wales, well, they voted for Brexit, so yeah. And this is some of her work here in the gallery. To be fair, this doesn't present them as well as what there is. It's a very awkward space. I got better photographs today, but they didn't get in. So she went to the Frisian Islands where the riddle in the sand was wrote, and she took a series of documented photographs and a film, and these beautiful little drawings that she took from the book. So, you know, Frank, when I seen your little drawings out the front there, I went, that synergy was like already connected without us even realising. And there's a wee sample of them there. And really stunning little works they are as well. And it's again putting that question in a photographic gallery, why are we having drawings? You know, and the answer is it comes from that and pictures, and it is what it is. And then there's a stunning little film of in the location, the site location, with little bits of sound that really people really have welcomed it well. And this is Marie McLean, and you will spot the typo if you're reading it. If not, just ignore it. Marie, she's presented. She was initially presenting older work through her father was interned. Are you all familiar with internment? Do you need me to give you a quick? Yeah. Well, basically, internment happened back in the late 70s, where the British Army were given permission to lift people off the streets and to throw them into prison and to torture them and do really what they wanted with them. And they did feel that he was a sympathiser, he was a researcher, he was an academic, but he was not an activist, and he had done nothing wrong. He was badly tortured, and he became one of the hooded men. And the hooded men, what they done with the hooded men is you constantly had this hood over you when they were torturing you. You couldn't see who it was, but they also put them into helicopters, took them up in the air, threw them about, and then they threw them out of the helicopter. Now, what they didn't tell them, that the helicopter was only 2 feet off the ground. But can you imagine the kind of mental torture that would put you through, thinking you're going to fall to your death? So, and they stopped it after a couple of years because it was the biggest recruitment the IRA ever had, to be honest with you, because all these men being put off the street. The focus of attention became on her because he was a researcher and he was an academic. There was a lot of media attention, so that had a massive impact on her family, with the word media coming to her. So she carries that through in her work, and the acknowledgement of that is really evident. And as I said, you know, she very much, she has a real strong connection to Scotland, and has lived here and worked here for quite a period of time. And there's only 12 miles of a distance. She tried to say it was 15, but it's only 12. 12 miles of a distance from Scotland to Ireland at its smallest point. Is it Larne or Donegal, did you say, that you can actually see it? You can see Scotland on a clear day.
Loads of places.
Loads of places.
Yeah.
And like, you know, it's sort of that relationship and the travelling and the impact that it has on our dialogues, our conversations. I remember as a child, we always got the Sunday Post. Is the Sunday Post still a thing now? Yeah. And Are We Willie and all that there. That was all that I grew up with, you know. So that those social connections and those culture connections is very, very deep. And she sees this, and this is a film she done, because we talk about borders and we're constantly infused about what borders are and what borders make us. I grew up, if you were wanting to go anywhere outside of Northern Ireland, that tiny little spot, you would have had to make miles in the queue to get to the other side, down south, or you were treated like a criminal if you were trying to get a plane to come over to the UK or even go to Spain until you got to Spain, and they were much nicer. But she wanted to question, what is a border? Why should we have borders? You rub the borders out, what happens? And the challenges of it, and who makes a border? Who's the one that says that that's the border? And I just thought, well, you know, there is that, and we don't have a border anymore, and it's invisible and you don't see it, and we're really happy with that. I think, and that's why Brexit has upset us so much, because that potential of bringing back a border is a reality. It hasn't gone away. And this is her show here. You will see that her work is really beautiful. She is probably more renowned for her filmmaking, but all of her work comes from her photographic archive, so it has a very strong connection. And she really wanted to respond to her as a child. Her father died a couple of years ago, and this was a homage to him, but she wanted to respond to a child and what it was like for a child growing up in the Troubles. And it very much was about that internment thing. And then COVID happened, and in between times, so she was meant to have her show just before COVID got too close to it. I had to cancel it a couple of times. Broke her heart and my heart. But actually within it, she really developed, and she developed new works. And her work became about, yes, that is my history. That is what I'm about. It is important to acknowledge it. But she also was about, what is it for me to be here now? Here as an artist, right here in Belfast, right here in this gallery. So it's really opened up all those questions, and the role of a female in a leadership role that her mother actually engaged with. So, and that's a project that we took out to the community. So yes, it was about internment, but it was really about how a woman had to change her whole narrative and her whole life to cope with the husband being just taken away. And many guys had never known if they were going to return. And she'd done other little drawings in these series of works and different things. She created, and I thought this was of interest, this is a vitrine of her father's flowers. And you maybe can't see that well, but within this work it's about, really it's about the Ulster Irish and Scottish connection. And I went, okay, well this is just perfect, I have to take this over with us. And then she responded to Belfast Exposed archive, and she done these series of beautiful little works that mainly as a wee bit of a fundraiser for us, but as a nod and wink to, you know, the communities that were there and are still there. And this has opened up again a whole new series of conversations, and people from the community that would never normally come into a contemporary art gallery are actually coming back to see themselves again. So it's been an absolute delight. And that's kind of me, and I'm going to hand you over to the lovely Trish.
Hello, thanks Malcolm for the invitation, it's lovely to be here. You've done the invitation, so I can just, introduction bit, so I can just quickly go through a little bit, give you an overview of our In Our Own Image programme. And what we've done with this presentation is try and respond to some of the themes that have come up in Frank's show, so it was lovely to get to see that show. So we are the National Centre for Contemporary Photography. We're based in Temple Bar. We've recently changed our name because thinking about some of the issues there that Malcolm raised, but also Deirdre, you know, photography has changed so much in the last decade. Say for quite a few years, for decades, we were very busy making work, developing work, showing work, and it was like a passing river. But as photography becomes more established and on a firmer footing, there's an awful lot of work going into that behind the scenes work that you're talking about, of building a base, of consolidating, of training people, of archiving work, of supporting artists in a much bigger way. So part of what we want to do, you know, we've been showing work for over 40 years, and a number of the artists we've been working with are starting to pass away, and there hasn't really been a plan around what happens to their archives. Often the family will be left with the work. So we set up an archive collection initiative so that we can work with artists to digitise their archives and preserve their work for the future. So as part of that, we started looking more broadly at the history of photography. And we've just come to the end of our decade of centenaries, which is, you know, it's both north and south. it's the marking the centenary of the foundation of the Irish state and the partition of the island. And that's raised a lot of issues around culture and identity. So even the title of this talk, what does it mean to be Irish, is up for grabs. What is photography is up for grabs. And even the nowness is up for grabs. You know, in Ireland, a lot of artists engage with the archive, continue to engage with the archive, and it's a form of, I suppose, getting to know ourselves, because we've had, like Scotland, a complex and complicated history. And we're only really now, in the last 20 years in the Republic of Ireland, starting to look at our history as we cast off the influence of the Catholic Church and start to deal with our history. It's only now that we're really starting to come to terms with things that have really impacted us, like the Irish famine. It's interesting to see you making this work, Frank, because very few people, very few artists have engaged with it in great depth. You know, it's particularly photographers. A lot of people have engaged with migration, but not that many people have addressed the issue of the famine. And so in looking at the history of photography, we wanted to map the history of photography from 1839 onwards, because it hadn't been done comprehensively. So we worked with museums, archives and collections from across the island of Ireland, and some private collections too. And it was really important in this centenary moment to do that in an all-island way, so that we could get messy with our history, because it's very, very complex and it's nuanced, and it's not one side versus another, and there are colonial aspects to it, but we've also been colonisers, and our own, you know, history as people who sent out missionaries, which is a form of colonisation of the soul. It's really problematic. So we wanted to look at that, and so we presented this in our own image series across a number of sites. The first show was in that's us, was in Dublin Castle, so that was presented as part of the history of the handover of the state. So one of the first surviving photographs is taken by Henry Craigie Brewster, who was Scottish. So this was pre-famine, so it proves that photography from famine was possible, but photography, because it was complex, costly and you know, time-consuming, it's likely that there weren't any pictures. But we do have very early daguerreotypes that are also pre-famine. So these are all, this is the first year of the famine, so it's interesting that there is that absence. But this is shortly afterwards, and as close as you come to a representation of what ordinary people looked like during the famine. So these are the kind of issues we were looking at. So quite contemporary issues around what Malcolm was saying, politics of place and cultural identity coming through in our history. Some of the best Irish practitioners were women. So Augusta Crofton Dillon was from Roscommon, and she was one of the leading photographers from this period. She was shown in London, so she was mid to late 1850s onwards, so she was incredibly talented and somebody that hasn't really been looked at extensively. Hugh Annesley, born in Dublin, fought in the Crimean War, brought back trophies, deeply, you know, problematic from an ethical point of view, but interesting nonetheless. And then he went on to inherit a big estate in Northern Ireland. So an Irish coloniser. Then the representation of the ordinary Irish people is something that's really interesting, and it's something that collector Sean Sexton has looked at extensively. One of the first people to collect photographs of ordinary people. He's got some great photographs of some of the families who migrated between Donegal and Scotland. So those ordinary histories start to come through. So you start to see the way in which people were photographed, and Irish people were often photographed with that colonial gaze, you know, barefoot, looking interesting but peasanty. And then you start to see photographs. So the vantage points are interesting: British soldiers, forecourts, cinematic. Then one thing we've done is to try and expand that notion of what it means to be Irish. Is we start looking at the history of the Irish through the family photo album. And that enables us to, I seem to have timings on this, to get complicated with. So we've worked with a lot of families, particularly in the border counties. This is just outside Letterkenny. So this is the UVF. So one thing we want to do is look at different interpretations of Irishness. So we've worked with Ulster Scots families, we've worked with former paramilitaries. This summer we've been working in Fermanagh, and that's really interesting. Some of that complicated nuance comes through in the family photo album. Ulster Scots Battalion, a lot of them, Ulster Scots were killed in the Battle of the Somme. Then we're getting into family archives. This is the Dean archive from Macroom, local photographer, but really unusual that people were really relaxed in front of the camera. Then you start to see women like Eleanor Wiltshire photographing in the 1960s, you know, a premonition of Ireland's rapidly changing demographics. So slightly over 1 in 12 people in the Republic of Ireland are people who've come to live in Ireland. So we have shifted dramatically in the last, say, 15 years, and that's had a huge impact. So that's raising lots of different issues for contemporary artists in how we address that, but also in coming to terms with our own colonial past and how we deal with it, and also the implications for our collections is something that's really interesting. This is work by a man who worked for the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, so it's a young man injured by a rubber bullet. So it's just interesting to look at these different vantage points, the view of the Troubles, again, going beyond the usual photojournalistic positions to look at the view from within. We worked in a show, we do a lot of work outside of Dublin, so this was a show we did with the Nerve Centre in Derry, and we also showed in the Regional Cultural Centre in Letterkenny. I don't know why it's come back. This is a subject that's of great interest to us because our Black Lives Matter issue in the Republic of Ireland, possibly the island of Ireland, is the representation of the travelling community, because there's still a lot of racism there. We're currently working with a really interesting artist called Marcus Bean Ward, who's doing an artist-led project. He's from the travelling community, and he's an artist and an activist, and he's doing a new project for us. So that's really interesting to start to probe into some of those things. And then for the recent protest show, which is part of our In Our Own Image programme, we worked, and Deirdre kindly contributed to that through their archive. But, you know, work that hadn't ever shown before. Joanne O'Brien, she worked with feminist organisations who came over to support the women who were in Armagh jail. But lots of women who made work during that time who didn't really get a showing because the photography structures were really small and there weren't the galleries there to show the work, there wasn't the money to show work. It's really interesting to actually go back and pull out bodies of work, you know, that didn't get a proper outing now that we have more resources and also different ways of showing, so we can show more. So this is Rose Kumisky, who was a feminist activist in the 1980s. This is a photojournalist, but this is his own private work. So when he wasn't working for the newspaper, he would go up and document the Troubles in Northern Ireland. This is the work we're currently working on. This is Tony O'Shea, who'll be one of our leading documentary photographers. We've worked with Tony for the last 3 years to digitise his archives. So that's been our kind of like our pilot project, just to do that whole exercise of taking someone's work and digitising it so it's preserved for the future. And Tony's worked extensively all over Ireland, but particularly around the borderlands and in Dublin. Fergus Burke. So countering the usual representation of the Irish pub and that issue of nostalgia, which is something that Frank has addressed in his work. You know, there's a lot of kind of, you know, hackneyed representations of Ireland, so this is a much more realistic view of an Irish pub. And Derek Spearsby, one of the most important kind of socially engaged socialist photographers, works in a grassroots way. We really have to persuade him to allow us to print them and put them in a frame and make them fancy things on, you know, on a wall. So, but he's just like an amazingly kind of committed activist. So it's been really nice to work with him and show his work. Wally Cassidy, so people documenting protest, and also, you know, we've had a lot of social change in the last 5 years, so it's really interesting for the current, really kind of politicised younger generation, the new tier of activists, to see this work that happened in the 80s, which they weren't aware of, because it hasn't really been recorded or preserved, so it's just been really interesting. Like, the audience for these shows was primarily young people, which was really great. Frankie Quinn, who does a lot with Belfast Archives. And then Pete Smith, who's, you know, documented, you know, West Dublin estates for 30 years from the inside. Then we get into people looking at the issue of emigration, which has been something quite a few photographers have looked at since the Blasket Islands. Then our new evolving, you know, globalised industries, which has transformed working practices. The effects of the EU, modernisation, motorways. John Duncan's work, Boomtown. John Duncan makes beautiful work about Belfast that still stands up today. David Farrell, this is an ongoing body of work documenting the search for the disappeared, who were people who were taken away by the IRA and buried in unmarked graves. So that's been an ongoing issue to be resolved, and that's one of the key things that needs to be resolved before there'll be closure for those families. The kind of a new directions first, you know, it's really important that we're working with people, particularly people who come from new communities, that they're encouraged and we find a space for them to represent their community's experience. So that's a new avenue for us, and it's great. And for the past 5 years, we've been working along the borderlands with about 15 artists on a project called Reframing the Border, and we've done a lot of work in Donegal with that. But to mark the centennial partition, it was very quiet because Brexit made things really complicated. So we worked with the Nerve Centre to put artists' images and texts at 9 random sites around the borderlands, some of which were quite surreal, like this one here. Kate Nolan has worked along the border on her Lacuna project since 2017, and that's continued to evolve. And she's chosen to work with young people who didn't grow up during the Troubles, so that's kind of been interesting to get their vantage points. That is the chip band, that's exactly on the border. Paddy Kelly, interesting body of work. His father was a former combatant, so what's interesting as well is the way the photography can create relationships, because you know, for Paddy and his dad, they got to know each other through the process of making this walk together, because often, you know, if somebody was a combatant, they wouldn't often speak about it, which is often the experience of people who fought. So, you know, this was kind of a way for them to kind of have this understanding of each other through photography. So these are IRA training sites. So again, it's that notion of the landscape and what it holds, and same with Frank's work, the traces of history that go through it, and the lie of the land, what the land tells you and what it doesn't tell you. So these are the borderlands. Some of the bridges were blown up by the British Army. This is Enda Bo's work. So Enda Bo worked with young people on both sides of what is called the divide, which is simplistic, but he worked with young people involved in bonfire culture, which is usually shown in a particular way. And Enda wanted to go beyond those kind of, you know, binaries, just to work with the young people to make a representation of them that would move beyond that. So he worked over and back for 5 years, and then he also worked with a young composer and musician, Max Cooper, and that was a really good way to engage the young people, because that was what had currency for them. So it took a long period of building the trust for him to work with these people, but it's a lovely series of work. You know, so he's actively avoiding those signs and symbols and traces that people usually bring into a photograph. Little hint there. And the young people love these portraits. This is Dragna Juricic. She's come to live in Ireland from the former Yugoslavia. So this is her experience of being a migrant in the borderlands, because it's a gunra plant, which is an invasive species, which is how she was feeling about it at the time. Then this is the work we're working at the moment to make a book. This is Brian Newman, and he's worked with the Orange Order, which I'm sure you know about. So this is, he's made this over about the past 5 years, and it's just taking a different vantage point again, looking at the rural lodges, which are quite different to the urban lodges, and looking at the role of the lodge and what it means to those people, and the men who struggle to maintain those lodges as a space where they can congregate, and it's that role of the lodge in the community that often gets overlooked. But one of the reasons that we enjoy working with communities like this that is really important, you know, with this talk about shared island and the possible removal of the border, is that people in the Republic of Ireland need to get to know people that they currently don't know or understand, and representations have been quite simplistic, so photography offers a way for us to build relationships and also to find out more about each other, but it really has to go. These projects are only made possible by long-term sustained commitment. You can't just go in, make a project and come out again, so you really have to build the groundwork over a long period of time. Kieran Dunbar, so these are diesel laundering sites along the border because of smuggling. It's always been along the border. There's a lot of money to be made in laundering diesel. So Kieran has really bravely, he's from Portadown originally, moved to live in Dundalk, which is south of the border, which is where I live, and he photographed diesel laundering sites, and that's brave. because, you know, people do not want to be watched, they do not want to be photographed in these areas. So, you know, you have to go and get permission from the lads, and that's going to be a book to burn it shortly. Neve Smith, this Institutions of Home. So again, you know, photographers looking at our difficult history. So this is the relationship between the church and mother and baby homes, and the role of the church in controlling people's sexuality, and all of that problematic history that we're only coming to terms with now. So this is why the archive is important to artists. Martin Seeds, this is a photograph of a tree from Stormont. Jim and Keogh, again, representation of Audrey houses, moving away from that picturesque, romantic notion of Ireland to really drill down to look at, you know, the world photographed. Miriam O'Connor, experienced woman living and running a farm. Claire Gallagher, second shift, looking at that second shift that often women have when they go home at night, and the domestic sphere. Shin Lynham, architectural perspectives, so a nod to our really messed up relationship between property and particularly in home ownership in Dublin. It's impossible. Dublin house prices are dearer than the centre of Paris. It's crazy. Shane Hynan, this is an increasing issue coming through in contemporary practices, is environmental concerns, sustainability. And this is Martin Bean's wards. This is his current project working with traveller community around Ireland. So that's us. So one thing that, you know, in this, all this talk about shared island, and, you know, we were kind of mindful that we work with similar artists often, but we have very, very different audiences. And I think some of the challenges that we've dealt with in recent years have also led us to think, well, how can we actually, you know, build opportunities for the future for artists, and not be competing for the same pool of artists, but actually work together to better serve artists, to make better use of our resources, and to also build audience. Because it's really difficult when you run a space and you're working on providing artists facilities and studios. We're often, you know, not able to get out there, as you know. It's why it's great to have a festival who are able to, you know, do that whole networking more than we sometimes can. So we thought we'd work together to set up the Irish Photo Network, which is supported by the Department of Tourism, Arts, Culture, Sports, Culture, Gaeltacht and Media. And so we got funding over the summer to set this up. Is that it?
And basically, there is a divide within Ireland, and yes, it's an invisible border, but there's still a monetary divide. So kind of both were looking at, that division stopped us looking over and above. An artist really affiliated themselves more with one or another, and we're far too small for that. And there's a shared culture of what we do, and Source Magazine would have been involved.
It's all Ireland,
Yeah, it's all Ireland, and sort of being involved in that. And we've also had many conversations about what are the needs of artists, and so it goes beyond what we're putting in our gallery walls. Belfast Exposed, we've had a Futures Artists programme for the past 8-9 years, and that's really helping get artists to move to the next step. And that's been very important and has worked exceptionally well. But what happens to them after that? And we find that, yes, sometimes they go to Dublin, sometimes it comes up, but how do they actually develop their career? And visual arts, photography isn't as bad because at least you can send an image, but it'd be very expensive in turn to work internationally. I'm not saying singers have got it easy, but all you have to do is record it and move on. Whereas artists do have that different kind of approach that is much more costly. So we felt within us all working together, we might be able to develop opportunities. And then Trish seen a bit of funding, which actually, thank God she did, enabled us really to get the network off the ground.
Because it's uniquely north and south. A lot of people might do a BA in the south of Ireland, but the MA programme is in Northern Ireland, so that's been a big shift in the last, and also links over to the UK as well. But it's been a unique kind of shift, because people travelling up and staying in Northern Ireland never stayed there before. So there's a unique north-south axis in it. But we're in the no man's land with the funders, because we can't get a touring grant to tour to Northern Ireland, but we can beyond, so it's not far enough, or it's too far in, so we thought we would just join forces. So for this first iteration, we've just picked mostly early career artists, but actually what we really want to do is try and build it out with artists across the span of their career, because people are emerging at all ages, and sometimes mid-career artists get overlooked. So we're just we're starting with this particular selection, but actually as it builds out, it's really important that we get a holistic approach, that's not one versus the other. And that's what's interesting about the way photography is kind of developing, is that as it gains confidence and really kind of builds strong foundations, it used to be that one thing would replace another, one form of practice would replace another, but actually I think now as we become kind of more confident, we're able to embrace a multiplicity of approaches and genres, and appreciate work, for the value it had within a particular context. So we, not very often, but occasionally you do end up pulling out an artist from 10, 20, 30 years ago who didn't get an outing. But for this iteration, it's mostly young, emerging artists.
Yeah, and what we've been able to do is build a website that, where do you go to look for an Irish artist? It's a photographer. There's no one given place, so at least this is going to give a platform to do that, and within itself it'll create its own form. So we're not dictating what it is, we're reaching out and we're asking the artists to tell us what they need it to be.
And so we commissioned 3 writers to write about contemporary photography in Ireland, just hopefully that will, because there's also a crisis around art criticism. There really isn't anyone in the Republic of Ireland who's writing for any of the national papers. We did have a very good critic, and he's retired. So there's this, there's a lot of repetition of press releases, but actually there is a problem with kind of critical writing around photography. So it's really important that we encourage that we're encouraging young curators, that we're bringing in different voices. So that's what we're trying to do with this platform. But also say to artists, work with all of us. It's not either or, that we're all there to support Irish photography, and also with a view that together we can help then have a stronger voice to promote it outside the island of Ireland. So I think that's useful too. So we've got really, really ambitious long-term goals. We'll see.
Brian Zoe Hamill, who's working in stills at the minute.
But one, it'd be really interesting to hear what you think, because I think that there is a troubling aspect maybe to contemporary practice. Photography in Ireland has been very focused on a number of set themes and ideas that almost became reductive. But now a lot of work is I think maybe it's post-COVID, is quite diaristic or self-focused.
A lot of it was self-focused, even the degree show was really off the self rather than being...
Which is good, but I think you do find yourself actively looking for those bodies of work that are responding to a really major theme beyond the self. And maybe that's the influence of Instagram. I don't know. This is a photographer who's working in London on building sites. It's really interesting. Again, it's that, Navi perspective.
And it takes us back to yours and your industrialisation, yeah. So there is an awful lot of commonalities. This is misbehaving.
Is it?
Yeah.
Pauline Rowan. This is her mother photographed in a now disused convent.
A central theme we're getting a lot of, there's a lot of performative elements within practice now as well. Some really interesting stuff. And it's crossing the lines of, is it photography or is it performance, and what is photography's role in that?
This artist used a lot of sculpture pieces in her work. She's really good. She just graduated from Leipzig, and this is a field that she's obsessively photographed year in, year out, but also it's got an electric fence, so it's that kind of performative. Sarah McCarroll, photo montage. So that's that. This is the photographer we're both going to be working with.
Yep.
She's making a major body of work around her experience of living with 2 children who are severely autistic. This is new work she's working on, which is her own uncle, who's a cross-dresser and Down syndrome. So that's it. That's us.
You want this used to pick up the questions, guys, right? So this has been videoed, as you may have noticed. I think it's all shots from the back, and we do cut these. So
We'll do that slide at the end if you want.
yeah, it's just if anybody doesn't want to play the video, just make yourself known, and we will not do that. So there's one mic that will go around here, and then be passed back to the speakers if anybody wants to ask any. We're going to open out now, and I think we're going to start with Frank.
Yeah. Hiya. Hope they can hear me. I could ask loads of questions to be honest with you, but I'm going to start with just a couple and then pass on the mic to whoever, because I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. One of the things that really interested me is you talked about archives and how you've just switched you've renamed yourself because of the way you're evolving. Scotland as a country's got quite a lot of really significant photographic archives, because Scotland was, like Ireland, really heavily involved in the early development of photography. But they're kind of spread out regionally, and there's no real focus anywhere. Well, I might get corrected, but in terms of being able to draw on those archives and show them in a way that's quite accessible for people as a nation, you know what I mean? And I wonder, in terms of where you're going now in your kind of developing direction, are the archives that you're speaking about all still resident in the different places, and you just draw on them when you have thematic exhibitions? Maybe you could say a little bit more about that. The other one was basically to both, which is there was also mention of the fact that you've got, as galleries, you both have very different audiences, and I just wondered how do they differ, because it's always something, especially if you're making work, you think. Okay, but maybe you guys could say something about that.
Well, maybe I'll say about the audience, it's just, I think that is that invisible barrier is about the lack of travel. We're 2 hours from each other, really, aren't we? So,
And I live in between the two.
And I know, interestingly. So the audiences that really come from, my audiences will be probably quite local. We do get Northern Ireland wide, but it's rarely you would get anybody from down south, unless it was a specific exhibition that they really wanted to go to. And it's nothing more than that, and I suppose your audiences would be the same.
Yeah. I mean, I think the more people from a photographer, practitioner background would know Belfast Exposed, because they studied there as well. So that would be, but we get a lot more general tourists, because a lot of people fly into Dublin.
Yeah.
So we get a lot more general tourists. That would be the main difference. Slightly bigger population, more of a hinterland.
But we didn't always have the cultural tourist. There was a reason for that. But actually it is growing, it is a growing market. And about half of our audiences would be tourists, and the rest would be really local.
So that's a big difference. But then in terms of archives, they're all very different. I mean, we did our history show in Dublin Castle, and we weren't able to do it as we'd like, which is why we're trying to get a new space, because it wasn't a museum space, it was a foyer space. And, you know, so we had to do reproductions rather than originals. Now, it doesn't really bother me so much because it's about the image rather than the artefact. But, you know, in the past we've done shows with Sean Sexton's artefacts in our own space. So they're radically different, every collection. And like one thing we want to do in January is have a discussion between the various different organisations that collect photography, because some collect, like the National Library have a brilliant collection, but they're a library organisation. Other organisations like the National Archives might have some digitised but not all. A considerable number of collections live in private family collections in the big houses, so the Madden Family Archive and Burr Castle, so we work with them, those personal families, to get some of their material. There's great archives in Ulster Museum and in Public Records Northern Ireland, but you're dealing with digital copies there. So it's really, really different. There's no one size fits all. But what we do want to do is get together with organisations who collect artists' work, which is why we changed our name, because we wanted to start making a collection of archives. It's about that conversation around, are we collecting everyone between us all? You know, there's a little bit of competition, but not that much. Actually, we really ought to have a system to make sure that no one falls through the cracks. You know, and what we want to do, and, you know, talking to people like the National Gallery, you know, it's like, if we work with people and digitise their archive, then what we want to do is make a portfolio set of prints, because it's really important that you have the set of prints made by the artist during their lifetime to their specifications, so that you have, you know, future estate prints that are, you know, that the artist has signed off on. But they also have to, I mean, you know, we just, part of our aim to get a bigger space, a museum style space, was the collection was very much part of that, chicken and egg. But it's really important that that work takes place, because us doing that with artists, that supports, for example, with Tony O'Shea, him then selling prints to the National Gallery, who in the last 5 years have started collecting photography and have a really fine photography collection. But those collections tend to be around, you know, the artist's best works, which is as it should be, but we actually want to collect those in-between things, because who knows, you know, Francesca Woodman, all these people, you know, Vivian Meyer, the materials an artist might think is their best work might not always have got the light of day over the span of, you know, the ebb and flow 30-40 years. So it's really important that that artist's perspective, their legs, their prints, all those things, ultimately that's what we'd like to collect, so you can then create a record of their practice beyond just the best known series, which is also important. So we want to have those conversations with all the organisations, and it's important for us that we're not duplicating anyone else's or on anyone else's patch, because I really don't have any time for people muscling in and creating a space at someone else's expense if they're doing good work. So it's really important that that's joined up conversation.
Anyone, any specific questions? It's interesting talking about collections for our guests' benefit here. There's quite some amazing collections of photography in Scotland. St Andrews, Glasgow University, Scottish National Galleries, for example. There's a loose association called Photography Scotland that came together, well, still is. It was kind of hit sideways a wee bit because of COVID. So the collecting and the exhibiting bodies for photography called Photography Scotland. So quite a few years ago, we used to, I'm just moving away from the speaker here in case we get feedback. We did something called Season of Photography, basically, and that was just to link all of the different initiatives happening throughout the country, because at any one time there's things happening all over the place, and you just don't see that. So it's to give some visibility to photography and to amplify the voice for photography. Another initiative I should mention, which has just stopped to exist in the way that it did, was the Jill Todd Photographic Award, which was a strong connection between Scotland and Ireland there, which included work from Ireland and Scotland within it, and that brought together a very good partnership of different organisations here, ourselves, Stills, SHOP, which is the Society for the Study of the History of Photography, who also do the journal called Studies, which is a regular feature, and it's been going since the 90s. So there's things out there, but it's I'm really kind of inspired to hear about the Irish Photography Network there, because I think things still need to cohere a bit more here. But we also do the Photography Networks in Scotland platform that I'll tell you more about later on. So I'm just letting you know that there's, again, similarities, but it's good to see that you're bringing the organisations together, so it's very important.
Cross-border aspect of it, the T-shirt department are friends for just a shared management, so it's also about getting funding for artists, I think because Ireland's been quite a conservative country, artistically, we've been slower than most countries to embrace photography as an art form. It was only in the late 80s, early 90s that the Arts Council started funding photography and seeing it as an art form, so we've been really conservative. I think it's part of our history. We're kind of worried about how we're represented, so there's a cultural insecurity there. So it's really important that we kind of work together and cross-promote and cross-support each other, and it's been really nice to do that and useful, but also to get funding opportunities for people and to keep going with that work in these hard-to-reach communities, because I think that's something we're both really committed to, is using photography and its ability to connect, to start to ask questions around identity and politics of place.
Because certainly in the visual arts, photography is the most accessible form, and everybody understands it, they don't feel threatened by it, and even if it's contemporary and it's a wee bit different, a photograph's a photograph, and with our use of smartphones, the kid, even from a young person's point of view, it's part of their life now. So I think it has got a long way to go to feel as valued as some of the other visual arts forms, but I think it's making its own way there quickly.
Yeah. It's also great that you can really bring photography out into communities. We worked in a community in Drum beside Anna McCarrick, which is the arts dressing space. We worked there for 2 years, and they were kind of stereotyped as Ireland's Protestant community. But we worked for 2 years, and the combination of working with an arts, Crass Climate made a famous body of work called Drum there. So, and we thought, well, we can't show that work without actually going to Drum and saying hello to people and telling them what we're going to do. But as it turns out, we commissioned a photographer to make a portrait. For 2 years, he worked with them, getting to know the people. But we also brought the Crass's work back, fixed up the pub, fixed up the roof, brought Crass back and showed the work in the pub where it was made. And we worked with the people to record their family album photographs and use the Protestant Hall to show them their photographs. So it was great crack, because the people were brilliant, they're lovely, lovely people, but also, you could then hear them explain to each other about Crass's work, going, no, this isn't a portrait of the village, this is actually a Scandinavian subjective viewpoint of the village. And it's like, oh, right. So it was great, and that circle between family album photographs, which gets the story going and gets you starting to talk about photographic representation and the subjective nature of it, mixed with an artist making work, mixed with bringing Crass back, was a really nice way of doing it. And then showing the work as, wall vinyls in the village was just, that's one thing we'd like to do more with, is bring those three elements together, because it gets real engagement going. Yeah.
It's a great book, that.
It's a great book, yeah, it's a really good book.
Anybody any questions? Robert? Sorry, how do do this?
Thank you. Yeah, I was interested in the comment about the kind of turn towards the personal, that we're kind of seeing, which I can identify in my own approach. I kind of wonder whether it's actually the same process, that the turn is the same in terms of discovery, but the direction is different in the sense it's towards personal, that a lot of people are trying to understand the universal through their personal experience rather than understand their personal through the universal experience. Yeah. So in fact, But I know I find the difficulty in that is that sometimes you because there's less structure, there's less understanding, there's less categorisation. That's a positive in the sense that the field is more open, but it's more difficult to communicate. And whether these are some of the things that are going on in that space, that in that turn, that's much richer than maybe we understand yet.
Well, definitely work coming from the personal, there's an honesty about that. Sometimes the objectivity in presenting in a universal context gets confusing. But I do think that deep-rooted kind of understanding of what the subject is about is really, really important. And that level of an artist giving that is significant. Yeah, definitely.
It's just challenging, if there's a lot of work being made around the same, that's where the challenge is for people to make something distinctive and to find a place in the programme that there's ebb and flow.
So that kind of focus on the self as well that you spoke about, you published a book last year on mass isolation.
Oh yeah.
Which was a project that ran for a few years during that period of COVID.
Yeah, we nicked that British mass observation title and messed it up. Well, photographers are all, we just noticed that as a way of making sense of the world, which is what this kind of work is, that photographers were photographing their experience of lockdown. It just seemed like an incredibly important record. So, and also people wanted to do something and they wanted to have a way to come together and to share their experience. So we just kind of thought, we'll do something called mass isolation, which is what it was. And then we rang around a few people going, do you want to do it? So it was a kind of random collection of people from Finland to impressions and format and Ballarat. It was about 87,000 people contributed photographs to it. It was grand. We thought it would end, we finished ours about 5 months later and then COVID kept going. But we felt people had said what they were going to say and people no longer wanted to make those, but it is kind of a nice, unique record. It was a lovely thing to do.
It's a great book that you can get from
didn't do that many. And publishing is one thing that we didn't touch on, but that we'd love to do more of this. We've increasingly gone back and publishing. We got this kind of set of books in our mind called Photo Books That Never Were That Should Have Been. And there's so many bodies of work that deserve a photo book, and yet again the photo book market is so rich, that it can be overwhelming at times. So the channels can get blocked, and I think that's there's not enough galleries and not enough spaces to show things, so it's difficult. We can't show, which is why we're trying to get a bigger space, we can't show the range or the scale of artists that we want to. We can't show big enough shows. There's just not enough places to show the work that deserves to be shown, so it's a challenge. It's tricky.
Thank you. Hi. So I'm just thinking about opportunities. Quite rightly, the work is in your promotion is of Irish artists. And what's lovely about this exhibition of Frank's is just that connection through the subject of migration. And so, are there other subjects that you maybe look to connect with international artists, Scottish artists, I'm thinking primarily, or have there been subjects like that in the past, and is there opportunity for that in the future?
Well, we've been nagging Malcolm for years because there is that real sense of connection, as Deirdre was kind of articulating there, between particularly Donegal. Like, I have friends from Donegal, like their families over and back for generations. I went to the Gaeltacht, everybody had family, immediate family in Glasgow, and that kind of, those other roots, especially with, your possible referendum coming up, and notions of identity and nationality are certainly really shared. There is a real sense of kinship, between Ireland, Northern Ireland and Scotland, and also with Nordic countries, almost going back to those as Viking, different ways of travelling around the world. There's those, but there's those issues. I mean, I think issues around shifting demographics, they're universal. So I think there's lots of subject matters that haven't been looked at a lot. I don't know if that answers your question.
We don't specifically do thematic ones per year. So we're always open for that conversation with artists if they have anything of interest. We have a number of different spaces during COVID because we couldn't exhibit, our doors were closed. So we created an outdoor space that is a digital screen with sound that is narrated, and we found different ways of exhibiting, and I've altered the spaces within the gallery so we can do a lot more. The only thing is we ain't got a lot more money, but we've been able to facilitate a lot more exhibitions, actually nearly have trebled what we used to do. So we're keen to do that. If there's a wall space, it's used, and we encourage that. But we always are open to conversation with artists, whether they be Scottish or anything else.
And do you think there are things then, do you think there are subjects or genres that
I don't know. I mean, the immediate one is definitely the kind of migration. And like you say, the connection with Ireland. I mean, my own connection, my name's Murphy, so it's like...
enough said.
Me and my brother, we got about 19 for a week thinking about our family history. So we decided to try and find our grandpa, who was over in Ireland somewhere, and we thought, we could go into a pub and he might look like us, and he'd be drinking a Guinness, that nonsense. Anyway, it turned out he stayed round the corner from us in Glasgow. And it's funny, see, when we found that out, it didn't matter so much. So there's something about that romantic notion and that connection with Ireland. So I think that's the main, from my point of view, the kind of family history and that kind of unknown history.
It's a democratisation of history, which is the easiest thing, which is why Sean Sexton's collection is so important, because it's only recently that we kind of overcome shame of poverty. And we're talking to Frank about this, and what, the historian Guy Biner speaks really interestingly about active remembering and active forgetting in the context of Northern Ireland, and that what you choose to remember, and so it's kind of, it's very subjective, but we don't, it's those working class histories haven't been extensively written about, and the diasporic experience has tended to focus on London or America, like Canadian Ireland Foundation get really cross because Canada gets overlooked. And talking to Mark Seeley in Autographing, he was saying that people don't understand the multicultural nature of the Irish diasporic experience, particularly with the migration in the 50s and 60s that coincide with the Windrush generation. We tend to think of ourselves as white, pale, and pasty, and that there was a lot more mixing than we recognise. So there's really interesting ideas around that, and the whole migration thing. With Ireland and our radically changing demographics, it's really important that we recognise and remember those histories and are hypocrites with people arriving in Ireland now. So I think that's a constant current debate around identity and responsibility.
We find that we didn't grow up with black communities or ethnic minorities, and because of ceasefire, we're now having an influx of especially refugees. Basically, the government's bringing them in, which is great, and saving them, Ukrainians, Afghanistans, but putting them in a hotel, and that's it. And even children, and that's it. And the communities aren't ready for it, so we're experiencing an awful lot of racism, deep-rooted hated racism. So kind of a loyalist community has nearly went into right-wing ism in itself. So those conversations are so relevant, whether it be down south or up north, and it's something we need to deal with.
Yeah.
It's not so a question, more of an observation. I've been spending a lot of time in Spain the last few years. I was interested in some of the work in post-conflict landscape sort of work, and Spain, I don't think it was before, but in the last 2 or 3 years, certainly in the mass of exhibitions that are on every summer in Foto España, there have been a number of artists directly addressing and Spain politically moving the general's body and all sorts of other things that have happened within the last few years. It was just an interesting resonance that a number of artists in Spain are really beginning to address those issues, and
Sometimes it takes
be.
a passage of time that people, feel safe. Often generations will pass away and go beyond lived history. We just partnered with the National Museum on an image and conflict show, which looks at our death centenaries. And there's pictures of dead bodies, and the use of the body as spectacle, and as a form of propaganda. But also it actively included perspectives on the First World War, and that was a noticeable dividend from the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, that people were saying that, people who from a Republican background that we work with, saying that they took out their First World War family photographs, people who served, because a lot of people from Ireland served in the First War, and put them on the mantelpiece for the first time. So sometimes, current politics really affect how things are made visible. So it's really interesting. Just
Just a kind of niche question. During active conflict, I guess photography is quite, or can be, a dangerous thing. Were combatants actually recording what they were doing, or was it considered too dangerous?
Well, there's one set of photographs I meant to put in and I didn't include. It's a smuggled camera series of pictures. We worked with Lawrence McElhinney as part of our photo album project, who's a former hunger striker. So he's got this lovely set of pictures. They're also been done in Wiley's scrapbook, but they smuggled the camera into the Maze prison just before the breakout, because nobody had any pictures, because there's absences in what's photographed and what's not photographed, which is important to say. There's so many absences, like mother and baby homes. We've got pictures smuggled out, by mothers, taken by the odd kind nun who took a picture of the babies before they're given away. But Lawrence McElhinney, they smuggled a camera into the Maze to take some pictures, and they're a bizarre set of pictures. So just like, those kind of slightly ropey 1980s ones, but just lads taking pictures, but then they had to stop because they were planning to escape. So it was like...
But then you have the like of James Barres, his photographs of Bloody Sunday. That was the only evidence that was allowed into whenever they found that there was a wrongdoing. So photography in a war-torn sense has a much greater role than the photographer while they're taking those images. And I do think we have to look at using photography for voyeuristic kind of and propaganda in its way, but that's what we've done since the camera's been invented.
It's always been an unreliable eyewitness.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. There's a documentary called Shooting the Darkness, and they made it with local photographers who had never intended to be anything other than the local paper photographer, and then the troubles happened, and they're talking about vantage points, which is something that we've looked at in our history thing. It's all about vantage points, and that's the work you're doing. Vantage points. Nuance. We worked with Pauline Vermeer. She curated a series of kind of edited extracts from 5 women, international women photographers, came to photograph Northern Ireland. Work never really been seen apart from Rosalind Fox Solomon before in Ireland. But the photographers who were working on the ground were saying that Republican side were much better at dealing with photographers. They would make them tea and go, oh, come on, we'll help you. So then the photographers would be standing on their side of the action, with the cameras pointed at the army or the security forces. So it was always from their perspective. So it's really interesting about where you're standing and who's taking the pictures. So yeah, it's interesting.
Was available on BBC iPlayer, that programme, for a while. I'm not sure if it still is.
Yeah,
Shooting in the Darkness.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah. John.
Yeah, I was just actually wondering if Deirdre touched on it earlier about outreach and your outreach people having lots of mental health expertise and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just thinking about like kind of particularly Northern Ireland currently over the last 4, 5, 6 years where communities are kind of waking up on a daily basis, and whatever happens in politics in London is having such a massive effect on you at the moment. And I'm just wondering how you're finding kind of space for artists and their communities to kind of come up for air within that at the moment, and kind of.
We're developing this program called Access Art Action. Embedded with it is our wellbeing methodologies that we use, but it's done in a very subtle way. And really what it's doing is it's encouraging them to have conversation about their issues. But where we're working at now is they create an action from the work we do, and that action can be a protest. That action can be a collection of images that actually are taken and sent to the councils, and to say, you know, one of the big things that's coming up is about our government, our lovely UK government's use of dehumanising and people who aren't working or on benefits. And there was one woman in our course, she was even afraid to get her photograph taken in case she got taken off her benefits. You know, those issues, and then that was with a group of women. They're now collecting documentaries about how that makes them feel, and what they're doing within the images they're using that as a visual that is being sent out. They won't have their name to it, the group will do it on their behalf, but it's a way of making them feel empowered to do something. And I think that's the worst thing can happen, whether you're in working class communities or not, feeling disempowered, feeling that there's no way out, there's no route to progression. And we also try to give them a wee bit of ambition and that little bit of hope that, you know, so we never just talk about what we're doing, we always talk about where we're going and what we can possibly do in the future. Now, don't necessarily always have the funding for it, but we make it happen somehow.
I was wondering if, because there's been so much talk about politics, it almost seems to me there's been a sort of politicisation of imagery. And I was just wondering if you could ever find yourself looking at photographs and seeing politics within a photo where it doesn't even exist, or politicising something, an image, almost out of existence, because you concentrate. It's almost as if these photos, a lot of them are like springboards to political debate. And do you find yourself sometimes looking at photos and forgetting about the image and the artistic merits of an image, and just seeing it as a political talking point?
Obviously there's a subject there to trigger your interest in it, but for me it always has to be about quality, and you know, that merit within the imagery is really important. I mentioned there the smartphone. Everyone can take a photograph, but they're not all going to be brilliant. So we're interested in artists whose work is of a quality, and that's not to say that the community work is segregated, because it's not, because we raise it up to that quality level. And I didn't mention that. It's like we treat it with the same reverence as we do an international artist exhibiting in the gallery. But if that's what if subject matter is what artists deal with, so you know.
The difference between art and something commercial is art is about something, it's asking a question, so often it is. But I mean, I take your point, I mean, there's been a lot of interest in abstract photography, going back again to some of the work, you know, in the 1930s and 40s. So, I mean, we're showing an artist, Roseanne Lynch, whose work is an abstraction. It's very beautiful, and I think, so that is there, but it's an arc, and there's lots of different ways of doing it. For our programme that I was showing you here, it's been primarily based around the centenary, so it's actively looked at politics of place and identity. But not every artist does that, but a lot of art is actually ultimately asking a question, not giving you an answer. So the best art is actually about something either existential or political.
And I suppose that's...
Or philosophical.
That's what they've been taught within university structures.
So you're making ideas visible. It's a visible way of communicating ideas. So the aesthetics alone, photography, I think it's Francis Hodgson calls it a slippy medium. You know, it's because of technology, it's really easy to make a beautiful picture. But and that's simple, but actually you need more, because photography is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. People on their iPhone are taking beautiful pictures every millisecond. So, you know, beauty alone, for me, is not enough for what I want. But that doesn't negate the value of people who just enjoy looking at a really beautiful picture. And there are lots of commercial galleries that sell photographs to service that strong demand for really beautiful pictures. So it's just a matter of where you situate yourself and what your interest is. We're in one particular set of it. Photography is a really broad church. it's all valid. This is just where we have chosen to position ourselves. Is that evasive enough?
But I suppose what is relevant in that is important, you know. But the aesthetics of photography has to be there. It has to be the foundation of it. So I would never ignore that over. It's talking about something political. I would, you know, it has to have both.
And going full circle to the start, too much history, so we're possibly slightly obsessed with it, definitely. You know,
at the minute, I think we kind of are.
Yeah.
And I think that's just what we've been through. Our recent history, even COVID, is like, it's challenged people. And one of the reasons why we're doing so much mental health is because we'd always done a bit of it, but we realised the explosion that was happening in the communities around ourselves. And unfortunately, in Northern Ireland, the rate of suicide is 15% in anywhere in Europe. And mental health terms, it's I think 25% in the rest of the UK. You know, different countries are different, but we're way out there. So that's what brought our attention to that. And we have developed techniques within photography that go beyond the image, because those participants aren't interested in creating the bigger narratives, they're interested in creating for themselves. So I think it's a number of factors rather than just politics.